Welcome back to Pave's Garage. It has been a hell of a long time. We're in a new garage, and in this video we're going to go through how I've made this mould, which is going to be used to create the carbon fibre roof skin for the Pajero Evo. But where have I been for the last 8 months or so? Well, I moved down from Queensland to New South Wales, got a little bit lazy after moving here, and also got distracted by some side projects like making the new mud flaps for the Pajero Evo, which mimic the factory optional ones. There'll be a video on these coming out soon. And I've also pulled apart the Pajero just to get out the springs and brakes, which are off getting remanufactured at the moment. So hopefully I'll be able to have some production runs of them made soon. And also aluminium side steps mimicking the factory optional ones. But now that all those distractions are sort of out of the way, I'm going to get back into getting the Evo on the road. So if you're not familiar with this build, there's a couple of old videos on this channel where I go over the crash and the initial phases of preparing this roof. But a very quick overview is that I've got this donor roof off a short wheelbase Pajero, which is pretty similar to the Evo's roof. And I've filled in the sunroof and have done some repairs to it, which is all going to be used to then create a mould, which will then be used to create a new carbon fibre roof. So, back to the task at hand, being that roof. I've been unbelievably slow on it. There's been a lot of frustrations with it, and I'm going to show you why. So, when buying body filler, there's two main types you can get. Just standard old car filler, or glass fibre filler. And I was using this one initially, which is really only designed to go on in very thin layers, only filling in very small holes, or sort of dents and divots in the surface. Whereas the glass fibre one is designed to really build up a really big thick layer of bog to really hide massive imperfections. So initially doing all that bog work using that sort of standard body filler just made me feel like it was going to take forever. I was only able to build up layers probably less than 1 millimetre at a time. It was taking forever. If I tried to make the layers any thicker, the bog would just clump and just wouldn't go on smooth. It was driving me absolutely nuts. But the other day, when I was in Supercheap, I saw the glass fibre filler. I hadn't really heard of it before. Did a quick Google search and realised that is 100% what I need to be using. Got a whole tin of it, and man, I've made so much more progress since using that stuff. But before I get into doing work in this video, I just want to explain the entire plan for repairing the roof on this Evo, because I don't think I've ever really done that before. So the overall plan is to recreate the entire roof skin out of carbon fibre. And the roof skin is just a large flat panel here on top of the roof, the front half of which is covered in bog. So I'm not replacing anything structural with carbon fibre, like the pillars or the sections between the pillars. So the donor roof, the front half of it matches the Evo's roof, but the rear half doesn't. Luckily, the rear half of the Evo's roof is relatively undamaged, so I'll be able to recreate that quite easily, but I need the donor roof to recreate the front half. So I'm going to recreate the two halves of the roof out of carbon fibre, join them together, and then remove the old roof skin off the Evo and replace it with the carbon fibre. While replacing the roof skin, I'm also going to have to replace the section which goes in between the two A-pillars across the top of the windscreen, as that was heavily damaged in the crash and I've just pushed it back into place. And I'll be able to do that just by drilling out the factory spot welds on the panel and replace the whole panel completely without actually cutting it. The last section that needs to be replaced will then be the section that runs between the A and the B pillars, as that was also pretty heavily stowed in. And with all that explained, it's time to actually jump into some work. So the first thing I'm doing is taking a speed file with some 36 grit sandpaper to the roof. This is just to basically get the basic profile and shape of the roof back into its original shape. Alright, it's been what feels like forever, and this thing is starting to look a bit like a roof again. The speed file is a perfect tool for this job. You can see all the light areas are the high spots, which have been sanded down quite a lot, and all the darker areas are low spots, which haven't been hit by the speed file, and need a bit more bog to fill them in so they can then be flattened out. The body filler or bog that I'm using is just a pretty standard off-the-shelf one from Super Cheap Auto. It's just a two-part. It has the body filler itself with a hardener. It's pretty easy to use, but however it's not the best quality. There are far better quality ones you can get from proper auto paint supply stores. But as you can probably tell with how poorly I'm applying it, I don't think having a good bog is really going to help me out. While I was editing this, I noticed that I'd gone over a lot of the high spots again with this new layer of bog. This was totally unnecessary and ended up costing me a fair bit of time later on with more sanding. And this time round, I decided to wear a face mask so I didn't end up looking like Al Capone. Alright, I've been sanding this thing for what feels like absolutely forever. And we're at a point now where it's all feeling quite smooth and even, and I reckon it's time for the next step, which is to use some blade putty to fill in all these little tiny holes. These are just left there from little imperfections in the bog when it's being applied. It's pretty normal, and the blade putty will just fill that in and then sand down flat quite easily. Get down. Alright, that is possibly the worst example of a blading putty job in the entire world. But it'll do the trick. It just needs to dry for a few hours and then it's back to sanding. So I broke out the excellent Ozito electric sander and spent a hell of a lot more time than I really wanted to just sanding this down. And what wasn't shown in the video was that I had to go back and apply some more blade putty several more times and then sand it all down again because there was just so many pinholes in that really poorly applied first layer of bog. So after a while, doing all the sanding with a pretty weak crappy sander was getting really tedious, and I knew I was going to have to do some spray painting soon. So I dropped a bunch of cash on a belt-driven air compressor. Got a few air tools, and that's made the job so much easier. After a while, the roof was finally ready to paint, so I made myself a makeshift spray booth. This wasn't really intended to try and make the spray job perfect. It was by filtering the air. It was really more intended to just keep all the paint from going all over the car and all over the rest of the garage. The next thing I did, for no apparent reason, was to mask up the roof. I'm not really trying to protect anything, so it's not overly useful. About the only thing that masking it up really did was basically give any of the overspray something to stick onto, rather than start floating around the booth or getting onto my garage floor. So the mould that I'm creating uses a tooling gel coat, which will adhere to primer or body filler. So I've got to give the roof a proper paint job. To do that, I'm just using some basic primer from Super Cheap Auto, and then on top of that I'll be spraying some proper automotive 2-pack paint. So because this was the first time using this spray gun, I decided to do a few test sprays on the butcher's paper underneath the roof. I'm certainly no pro at using these things, given this was literally the first time, but based on what I saw in other YouTube videos, you'll want to adjust the settings on the spray gun to get a nice elongated oval spray pattern coming out of the spray gun. So with that expertly calibrated within a matter of seconds, I got stuck into it, spraying in my nice airtight spray booth. Alright, so I've just finished the first layer of primer, and there's a problem. The primer has really highlighted, but my surface finish with the bog just has not been good enough, and there's just lots of these little tiny pinholes showing up that I just couldn't see before. So I don't really have much of a choice here except for to break out the blade putty again and try and fill all of these in, sand them, and then re-attack with the spray primer.
One eternity later.
Alright, it has taken a while, but gone in with blade putty, filled in all the little pinholes, sanded it all back, and it's looking a lot better now. But just before we get back into working on the car, just a quick reminder to check out pavesgarage.com, where you can buy some sweet shock absorbers for your Pajero Evolution so you don't crash yours like I did. And the new mud flaps are now available, which mimic the factory optional mud flaps. And check out some of the other merch as well, if you want. Anyway, back to work. I ended up spraying about 5 layers of primer onto the roof, just so I had a really thick surface to sand down a lot. To sand it down, I just went over some of it with a block with, I think, 120 grit sandpaper, and then moved on to 320 grit sandpaper on the random orbital sander. And I didn't film it, but after this I went down to 600 grit sandpaper, just sanding it down by hand. And I've picked up a whole bunch of proper automotive 2-pack paint in the Mitsubishi Pajero Evo's Sophia White W09 paint code, just for fun. And going to mix it up with the required amount of hardener and then a reducer. We need 2 parts hardener to every 2 parts of paint to every 1 part of hardener, and then 10% reducer on top of that, all by volume, mixed up in here before we paint. Hopefully that made sense, because I've never done this before and I've got no idea what I'm doing. So as I just mentioned, this stuff is required to be measured by volume, as opposed to things like resins, which I'm using for the carbon fibre and fiberglassing. That's all measured by weight, so that's always an important thing to check whenever you're working with stuff like this. The mixing bucket that I'm using has a whole bunch of predetermined measurements all labelled around on the inside, and it makes it really easy to measure these things by volume. And you get these things at just about any hardware store or specialised automotive paint stores. And the last thing I'm going to do before I start painting is give the roof a good rub down with a tack cloth. I did this before doing the primer as well, but just didn't film it. But a tack cloth is essentially just a sticky cloth which will pick up any dust particles and whatnot, which will ruin your paint job. And with that, it was back into the hermetically sealed paint booth. Now, painting an entire car like this in a garage is definitely not something I'd recommend. While this makeshift spray booth has helped stop to get a lot of the paint onto the Evo and being spread around the rest of the garage, it certainly hasn't stopped a lot of dust particles getting onto the roof, and it has somewhat ruined the paint job on the roof. So when it comes time to actually properly paint the Evo, I'm going to be handing that over to a pro. Alright, the painting is done, and it is looking a fair bit better than the last attempt. Overall, it's pretty smooth. There's some blemishes here and there, like lots of little specks of dust which have gotten underneath the paint and caused little dots here and there, but overall, I think it's going to do. So the next thing we're going to do is actually take a mould from this thing. To do that, we paint a gel coat over the entire thing, and then put some fiberglass and resin over the back of that, then pop it off, and that'll leave a perfect imprint of the roof. However, I'm going to be doing that in a part 2 because this video is just getting far too long. So remember to like, comment, subscribe, share, all that usual YouTube stuff, and we'll see you on the next one.
Get down.